Joseph Stalin, great leader, or bloody dictator. Joseph Stalin, one of the most counter-narrative figures in the history of mankind, has left his continuous mark on the path of the Soviet Union. In this video, we will try to understand Stalin's complex personality, analyze various aspects of his reign, and give an objective assessment of his contribution to history. Let us look at the period of collectivization, industrialization, political repression, and victories in World War II, facing difficult decisions and consequences. Let's find out what motivations and strategies were behind his decisions, and try to understand if Stalin could do differently. Stalin's assessment as a dictator, genius, or great leader includes an analysis of various aspects of his rule and an unequivocal assessment of who he was, as many have done for years. The assessment of Joseph Stalin's identity as a dictator, genius, or great leader is a complex and controversial issue, and differing views exist among historians and the public. It is important to note that these three characteristics are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and Stalin probably includes elements of each. Stalin played a key role in the transformation of the Soviet Union into a world power, industrializing and collectivizing, which played a decisive role in winning World War II. His strategic genius was seen in navigating difficult world circumstances and in building a powerful military complex. Stalin led the country in a period of intense development, turning from an agrarian society into an industrial one. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union became one of the world's great powers, playing a key role in geopolitical events. To appreciate Stalin must also take into account the dark sides of his rule, such as mass repression, the Holodomor, and the infringement of the fundamental rights and freedoms of citizens. Such an analysis requires an integrated approach and takes into account the multifaceted aspects of its governance. The first person of the state does nothing for no reason. Why he did what he did and could do otherwise. First, define the dictator's definition. A dictator is a political leader who wields absolute power and controls the state or government, often using authoritarian and repressive methods of government. During his reign, the Soviet Union was effectively governed collectively, and Stalin was not an absolute monopoly of power. He was a key player in Soviet politics, and his power was shared with other members of the Politburo and the Soviet leadership. His reign was a period of radical change, in which took place collectivization, industrialization and modernization, political repression and terror, victory in the Second World War, the formation of a powerful force. Collectivization in the Soviet Union was a wide-ranging policy pursued from the late 1920s to the early 1930s, aimed at changing the structure of agriculture. This included the establishment of collective farms and the dismantling of individual farms. Collective farms were collective agricultural societies in which peasants united their lands and resources. The idea was to create more efficient agricultural structures, freeing up resources for industrialization. In the early 1930s, collectivization became more coercive. Peasants were invited to join the collective farms, and those who refused faced repression, confiscation of property, or even execution. Some regions, especially Ukraine, witnessed the Holodomor, an artificial famine that killed millions of people from hunger. Collectivization led to significant social changes. It wiped out traditional forms of rural life and family life, provoked massive protests and resistance from peasants. As a result of collectivization, the Soviet Union gained access to large agricultural resources, which contributed to industrialization. However, the efficiency of collective farms was often low, and the transition to collective farming was accompanied by a loss of experience and traditions. Collectivization was one of the most tragic chapters of Soviet history, causing considerable suffering and having long-term social and economic consequences. Why did Stalin decide to pursue this policy? Collectivization in the Soviet Union, conducted in the late 1920s and early 1930s, was carried out on the initiative of Joseph Stalin. Despite different interpretations, there are several key motivations that may have inspired Stalin to pursue this policy. One of the main motivations was the need to industrialize the country. Stalin saw collectivization as a means of liberating agricultural resources and ensuring industrial growth. The peasant lands were organized into collective farms, which, according to the Stalinist leadership, should improve the efficiency of agriculture and provide additional resources for industrialization. Collectivization gave the state greater control over agriculture. Collective farms became a form of state ownership, which allowed the management to more actively interfere in economic activities. Elimination of class enemies. Stalin saw peasant fists rich peasants as potential class enemies. The collectivization was accompanied by reprisals against those who resisted or refused to join the collective farms, leading to mass arrests, cleanings, and, in some cases, executions. Stalin believed that collectivization would help combat food problems, create a more stable supply of agricultural products, and provide the country with a food installation. However, it should be noted that collectivization faced strong resistance from peasants and caused disastrous consequences, such as the Holodomor in Ukraine. Along with these tragedies, collectivization has left long-term negative effects on agriculture and society as a whole. The question of whether Stalin was right in his actions during collectivization has been widely debated among historians and political scientists. The answer to the question whether Stalin could do otherwise is complex and depends on the point of view. Some argue that alternative approaches could lead to more favorable outcomes, while others argue that the context and circumstances of the time did not provide many options. Industrialization of the USSR, the way to power and contradictions. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Soviet Union faced the need to build its own industrial base in order to ensure the country's economic independence and competitiveness on the world stage. This period was marked by severe post-war destruction, civil war, and economic crisis, which created an urgent need for modernization and development. In the context of the revolutionary events of 1917 and the subsequent Civil War, the economy of the Soviet Union was in ruins. Industries were looted, infrastructure destroyed, and the economy in disarray. This forced the Soviet leadership to take urgent measures to restore and modernize the economy. Joseph Stalin, who became General Secretary of the Central Committee of the G2B in 1922, acted as an important catalyst for industrialization. In 1928, the first five-year plan was launched, which became the starting point for the rapid transformation of the rural Soviet Union into an industrial power. The plan included ambitious targets to increase industrial production, develop new territories, and develop a transport network. One of the key moments in the start of industrialization was the collectivization policy pursued in parallel with the first five-year plan. The creation of collective farms and the liquidation of individual peasant farms meant freeing up resources for industry, but also caused massive resistance and faced serious problems, including the Holodomor in 1932 to 1933. The first five-year plan ended in 1932 with visible success in industrial development. The growth of industrial production, the development of new territories, and the creation of a powerful transport infrastructure were the main results of this period. The onset of industrialization had a significant impact on Soviet society. Economic and social changes included a shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy, a shift in the structure of the labor force, and a reallocation of resources to heavy industry. All these factors formed the beginning of industrialization in the USSR, a complex and controversial period, which in the following decades remained a key element of Soviet history and the formation of the country as a world power. After the Civil War and the devastation caused by the revolution, Stalin saw the need to ensure the country's economic independence. Industrialization was intended to make the Soviet Union less dependent on external resources and to provide it with economic autonomy. Stalin sought to create a powerful industrial and military base for the country, preparing for a possible war. The experience of World War I and the threat posed by fascist Germany required the strengthening of Soviet military capabilities. Industrialization involved modernizing agriculture to increase productivity and provide industry with the necessary resources. This was aimed at eliminating the peasant objective and creating a modern agricultural sector. Stalin sought to develop Soviet industrial power, making the USSR one of the great industrial powers. This included the development of heavy industry, metallurgy, energy, and engineering. These motivations formed the basis of industrialization efforts in the USSR and had a significant impact on the development of the country during the 1930s and 1942. All these factors formed the beginning of industrialization in the USSR, a complex and controversial period which in the following decades remained a key element of Soviet history and the formation of the country as a world power. The assessment of Joseph Stalin's actions regarding collectivization and industrialization depends on the point of view and the criteria used for analysis. It is important to note that the assessment of such historical events is always open to interpretation and may vary depending on political, ideological, and cultural beliefs. Great Terror and Change 1936 to 1938. From November 25 to December 5, 1936, the extraordinary 8th Congress of the Soviets of the USSR was held. This Congress adopted a new constitution of the USSR, 1936, also known as the Stalin Constitution. The Stalinist Constitution of 1936 provided for direct and secret elections. Under the Constitution, citizens of the Soviet Union had universal, direct, and secret suffrage. It guaranteed equality before the law and equal rights for all citizens, regardless of their social status, nationality, or religion. Quote from Stalin's speech at the Congress: Soviet power disenfranchisement of non-working and exploitative elements. Not for eternity, but temporarily, until a certain period. Isn't it time to review this law? I think it's time. It is said that this is dangerous, as elements hostile to the Soviet power, some of the former White Guards, fists, priests, and so on, can enter the supreme bodies. What are they afraid of? First, not all former fists, White Guards, and priests are hostile to the Soviet power. Secondly, if a people wear and choose hostile people, it will mean that our campaigning work is bad, and we have earned such a shame. Unquote. The Stalinist Constitution of 1936 contained certain provisions regarding elections and representative bodies. Here are some key points. The Constitution declared universal and equal suffrage for citizens of the Soviet Union, regardless of class, national, or religious differences. The Constitution provided for the election of deputies to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, which was the highest representative body. Elections were conducted by universal, secret, and direct suffrage. Deputies of the Supreme Soviet were chosen from 3 groups of deputies: workers, peasants, and intellectuals. This reflected the principle of union of the 3 main classes in Soviet ideology. The Constitution ensured the representation of workers and peasants at all levels of government. In accordance with the Constitution, the Supreme Council elected the Council of People's Commissioners, the highest executive body. The Constitution recognized the existence of several political parties, but the Communist Party remained the only legal party with political power. Stalin sought to create the impression of democracy and legitimacy in international and domestic frameworks. The adoption of the new constitution provided an opportunity to present the Soviet Union as a country with democratic institutions and the protection of fundamental civil rights. The ideological component was also important. The creation of the image of popular democracy and friendship of peoples helped to maintain the ideological legitimacy of Soviet power. The constitution included rules on minority rights and self-determination, which appeared on paper as a guarantee of equality and freedom. Repression related to the period 1936 to 1938 began after the adoption of the Stalin Constitution of 1936. Specifically, from 1936 to 1938, During the formation of the new constitutional system, massive political repression took place in the Soviet Union, including the arrest, indictment, and destruction of political opponents, as well as those considered enemies of the people. The main objectives of the repression during this period were to suppress any possible opposition groups, including within the Communist Party, and to strengthen control over society. The causes of mass repression remain complex and multifaceted, and their detailed analysis requires taking into account the broad context of political, social, and economic factors at that time in the history of the Soviet Union. The connection between the Stalin Constitution, the period of repression, and Nikolai Yezhov NKVD characterizes the events and changes that took place in the Soviet Union in the 1930s under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov was the head of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, which was later renamed the NKVD People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Yezhov was one of the key implementers of the policy of repression. As head of the NKVD, Yezhov directly organized and conducted arrests, interrogations, and mass shootings. His role in the Great Terror was extremely important. During this time, the forced labor system known as the Gulag was expanded. Millions of people were sent to camps where they were forced to work in difficult conditions. The end of mass political repression in the USSR in the late 1930s, including 1938, has several explanations. By the late 1930s, the policy of mass repression known as Big Terror had achieved its main goals. Opposition within the party and society was suppressed, and potential threats to Stalinist authorities were minimized. At the end of 1938, Nikolai Yezhov was dismissed from the post of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, and his replacement was Lavrentiy Beria. This change of leadership in the NKVD could signal some changes in policies and methods of harassment. After 1938, the situation in the Soviet Union began to normalize. Repression did not disappear completely, but their scale significantly decreased. Stalin's regime gradually moved to a more conservative and stable phase. In 1938, the Soviet Union granted amnesty to certain categories of prisoners. This amnesty was a partial response to domestic and international pressures related to the scale of political repression in previous years, especially during the Great Terror period of 1937 to 1938. The amnesty affected certain categories of prisoners, including those arrested on political charges and convicted between 1921 and 1935. The release was subject to certain conditions. For example, many persons were sent to the regular parts of the Red Army. One of the terms of the amnesty was to refrain from massive political repression for some time. This was an important signal of change in government policy. International society drew attention to the policy of repression in the Soviet Union, and the amnesty in 1938 could be a partial response to pressure from foreign partners. The end of mass political repression in 1938 in the Soviet Union was partly due to the efforts of Joseph Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria. The process had several key aspects. An important role in the end of the repression was played by the change of the head of the NKVD. In late 1938, Nikolai Yezhov was dismissed from the post of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, and his place was taken by Lavrentiy Beria. This led to a change in approach to repressive policies. Under Beria's new leadership, a review of repressive policies began. Soviet leadership realized that the scale of terror became excessive and could create internal and external problems for the country. International society drew attention to the policy of repression in the Soviet Union. Stalin and Beria understood that international condemnation could affect the image of the country and its relations with other states. The approach to the policy of repression was partly related to the country's readiness for the forthcoming Great Patriotic War. The approach of war required the mobilization of all forces and resources, and the policy of mass repression was perceived as a potential threat to stability. As a result of these factors, in late 1938 and early 1939, political repression decreased significantly. The amnesties concerned certain categories of prisoners, and it was decided to ease the policy of terror. Stalin and Beria were key players in this process, deciding to change the leadership of the NKVD and ease the policy of repression. However, it is worth noting that this was a partial and temporary transition to a softer line in the sphere of political repression. This period was characterized by radical economic and political transformation, but also by severe social and human suffering caused by repression and terror. This was a review of the period from 1928 to 1938 of the Stalinist rule. He could have done things differently. It's a topic of discussion. Whether Stalin was a dictator or great rulers, it also depends on the conviction and taste of both historians and forgiving people. Personally, he's not good or bad to me. I try to understand the environment he's been in, and he could have done something different. Undoubtedly, Stalin was a great man in the history of mankind, and especially in the history of the Soviet Union. Stalin has both negative and positive sides, but what Stalin made a great power out of a poor country is one thing. When I die, a pile of rubbish will be put on my grave, but the wind of history will sweep it apart ruthlessly. Joseph Stalin. If you liked the video, like it and write in comments your opinions.